read your story about the families.
Yeah.
I mean, it's
It was right here.
Yeah.
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 All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Tonight, we are delighted to welcome New York Times bestselling author Robert P. James to discuss his new book, The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy and the Path to a Shared American Future. Robert will be in conversation tonight with Reggie Williams, PhD, Associate Professor of Theological Studies at St. Louis University here in town. So let's give a warm welcome to So before we begin, tonight's event is only possible because of your support. When you shop at Left Bank Books, your money stays right here in your local economy. So it helps to keep the parks beautiful, the streets paved, everything else that we love about St. Louis. It keeps it going strong. It also supports us and allows us to sell books that we sell and to support others such as this. So thank you for shopping local and for joining us tonight. Everyone joining us from online, thank you so much for being here as well, wherever you are. We're happy to have your pixels in attendance. You'll be able to participate in the Q&A tonight by leaving your question as a YouTube comment, so I'll keep an eye on that and we can make your questions. Thank you so much for being here. We at Left Bank Books are always working hard to plan new events for readers of all ages. If you're in the mood for a double feature tonight, we've got another event following this one at 7 p.m. Will Letch will be here to discuss his new novel, Lloyd McNeil's Last Ride, which is a surprising, unforgettable blend of suspense, humor, and compassion. Fantastic writer, so if you'd like to stick around, otherwise the full calendar of our events can be found on Now for tonight's event. Robert P. Jones is the president and founder of the Public Religion Research Institute and a leading scholar and commentator on religion and politics. He writes regularly on politics, culture, and religion for The Atlantic, Time, and Religion News Service. He is frequently featured in major national media such as MSNBC, CNN, NPR, The New York Times, The Washington Post, and others. He holds a PhD in religion from Emory University and a master's in divinity from Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. He's the author of White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity, which won a 2021 American Book Award, as well as The End of White Christian America, which won the 2019 Gowermeyer Award. His new book is titled The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy and the Path to a Shared American Future. Taking the story of white supremacy in America back to 1493 and examining contemporary communities in Mississippi, Minnesota, and Oklahoma, models racial repair and the hidden roots of white supremacy is full of urgency and insight, according to the New York Times, and it helps to chart a new course toward a genuinely pluralistic democracy. As I mentioned, our conversation partner tonight is the wonderful Reggie Williams, Associate Professor of Black Theology and African American Studies at SLU. He's the author of Bonhoeffer's Black Jesus, Harlem Renaissance Theology, and The Ethic of Resistance, which was selected as a Choice Outstanding Title in Theology in 2014. He's a board member of the English Language Section of the International Diederik Bonhoeffer Society, former board member of the Society for the Study of Black Religion, and the Society for Christian Ethics. His current work includes a story of complicated Christian response to fascism and a study of ethics for a better response to social injustice. So for a wonderful conversation and to discuss this fascinating, wonderful book, please give a very warm welcome to both of our guests tonight, Robert Jones and Reggie Williams.
Me? Well, thank you all. Am I on? Yeah. Maybe not. Okay.
Yeah.
Good? Yes. Yeah. Well, thank you all for being here. And I should say that we have not had a conversation in person ever. So I've followed Reggie's work, and when I got the invitation to come to an event here, I couldn't think of anybody better to be in conversation with. So thank you so much for being here. And we do have copies of Bonhoeffer's Black Jesus here as well.
Oh, we do.
So yes, I think I saw them over there. I'm pretty sure. Yes. Yes, we're good.
Yeah.
So for all of you online as well, Bonhoeffer's Black Jesus is worth the read. I'm really happy to be here in conversation with you. So thank you for taking the time to do this.
So thank you so much for the invitation.
I thought I'd start out with just a read, and then we're going to have a conversation. and I don't really know where it's going to go. So Reggie's going to kind of guide us into some topics, but it didn't occur to me actually until I was on my way here that the opening story in the book is a St. Louis story. So the book largely focuses on Mississippi and Minnesota and Oklahoma, but there is an opening story that is literally right here. So I'm staying at the Hyatt down by the Arch way, and we were just talking a minute ago at all of the symbols, right, that I'm sitting right in the middle of at that hotel. So I'm staring at, and on this side of the river of the Arch, right, and the Arch is, of course, it was originally called something like Jefferson's westward expansionist monument, right, before it was like, the Arch way, but it is, the largest, most prominent symbol of manifest destiny that we have in this country. And so thinking, I wrote right about that in the book, but that's there. And then right on the other side is, of course, the old courthouse right there, which was a site of slave auctions. There, I went to a ball game last night. Sorry for all of you St. Louis fans, it was really ugly, I have to say. But where the ballpark and that ballpark village is, there was a slave pen there that was a holding area for the slave auctions that happened. And of course, the river was the main mode of transport, right, for transporting enslaved people. The phrase "sending you down river" comes from here, right? To be sent down the river. That's being sent to my home state, Mississippi, right, from here. And it was like one of the worst things that could befall you, right, as an enslaved person, to be here. Reverend Tracy Blackman spoke at this conference I'm at here in town, the Parkland Baptist Fellowship conference, and she made the point that, like, those people who were standing on the courthouse steps could see freedom across the river, right? But that's how close they were, and then we're getting shipped the other way down the river. So I want to read just take me about 2 to 3 minutes, but this opening story, because I think it sets the table for the broader story that I tell in the book, and for really the broader way of understanding the American story in which we find ourselves. So here we go. On May 4th, 1863, the steamboat Northerner pushed up the Mississippi River from St. Louis, bound for Fort Snelling, a military outpost north of St. Paul, Minnesota. Just a few miles into the journey, Captain Alfred J. Woods encountered a large handmade raft adrift in strong currents. Aboard were 76 African Americans, 46 men, 10 women, and 26 children. The leader of the determined group was Robert Hickman, who was attempting to free himself, along with his family and neighbors, from enslavement on a plantation in Boone County, Missouri. That's Columbia, right? Not too far from here. Hickman, a preacher who could both read and write, had seen newspaper accounts of President Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation 4 months earlier. Although the proclamation did not apply to Missouri, because Missouri was under Union control, the news nonetheless inspired Hickman to begin plans to escape north. The Hickman party aimed to reach free soil by way of the river, which was by then safely patrolled by the Union Army. They embarked under cover of darkness on the moonless night of May 3rd, but because their makeshift craft was not equipped with sails or oars, they drifted for a day in the wrong direction before encountering the Northerner. Seeing the floundering party with so many children aboard, Captain Woods asked if they needed assistance. Sympathetic to their plight, but also knowing that the strains of the Civil War had left Minnesota with a labor shortage, Woods ordered the raft to be securely tied to the steamboat and offered to take them as far as his final destination. Neither Woods nor Hickman anticipated the vitriol that awaited them. On May 5th, the Northerner approached the levee in Lower Town, on the outskirts of St. Paul. As local dock workers, mostly Irish, caught sight of the self-emancipated African Americans, commonly referred to as "contraband" by whites, on the trailing raft, they became increasingly agitated, seeing them as competition for jobs. As word spread, a threatening crowd gathered on the levee. The commotion was so great that the St. Paul police arrived on the scene. But after assessing the situation, they sided with the mob and threatened to arrest not the Irish rabble-rousers, but the black silencers, should they disembark. Captain Woods ordered the boat with his trailing raft to steam on to Fort Snelling. There, Hickman and his party came ashore without incident on May 5th, but they were met with an unexpected sight. Hundreds of disheveled Native Americans were bound together, forcibly assembled near the docks. The desperate and anxious crowd they encountered were part of an original group numbering more than 1,600, mostly women, children, and elderly Dakota people, who had been held under armed guard all winter, following the Dakota War the year before, in a miserable encampment below Fort Snelling. Unbeknownst to them, Minnesota government officials and military leaders were awaiting spring thaw that would allow for their mass deportation downriver from their ancestral homelands to a bleak reservation in the Nebraska Territory. By the time the ice finally melted and river levels rose, hundreds had died. A group of 770 Dakota people had been shipped off the day before on another steamer to Davenport. Having set the Hickman party safely ashore and unloaded the wagons and supplies for the military fort, Captain Woods ordered preparations to receive his next cargo. 547 Dakota people, whom he was transporting for the fee of $25 per head, plus 10 cents a day for sustenance. Soldiers from Fort Snelling herded the ragtag remnant aboard the Northerner like so many cattle, as one observer put it. As they pulled away, a local minister's wife remarked, "May God have mercy on their souls, for they shall receive nothing for them." Neither Hickman nor his companions nor the Dakota people, but have had the perspective to realize they were witnessing the momentous final chapter of both chattel slavery in the U.S. and Indian removal in Minnesota. They would not have grasped the paradox the two groups represented that on the banks of the Mississippi River. That the end of bondage for Hickman's band also marked the last vestige of sovereignty for the Dakota people. And they would certainly have been unaware that in the closing weeks of 1862, just 5 months earlier, President Lincoln was simultaneously considering two documents that would dramatically change the fate of each group: a warrant for the mass execution of 38 Dakota men and the Emancipation Proclamation. This encounter on May 5th, 1863, contains multiple narrative streams, each of which tells a different story about America. The question is, which do we follow? Do we tell the story of Fort Snelling, the military outpost established to protect the westward expansion of settler colonialism? Do we embark back down the Mississippi River to Missouri in the story of enslaved Africans in the South? Do we push upriver from St. Paul to its headwaters in stories of indigenous peoples populating this land for millennia? Or do we portage east and across the larger waters connected to the homelands of Europeans who first set foot on these shores just a few hundred years ago? Each narrative pushes back to a different beginning. So that's the opening of the book, and I pulled that story forward because it weaves together this interaction between Europeans who were kind of justifying their occupation and enslavement of the country of Africans and genocide of Native Americans with Christian theology. And this interaction that often gets told in kind of siloed history, the African American history over here, Native American history over there, and we don't really pull the two together. And in this book, what I wanted to do was tell this deeper story that behind the history of enslavement is always the history of genocide and displacement of Native Americans there. And like, again, in St. Louis, we see this like so. There, the other one I didn't mention is Dred Scott, right? So we have right there at the old courthouse the statue of Dred Scott, his wife. And of course, this is also was a precipitating event for the Civil War, right? That they not only denied the ability of any African Americans to be considered as citizens, but they also ruled unconstitutional the Missouri Compromise in that same event, which then helped kind of stir tensions and lead to the Civil War. So all of that is like right here, right in this story. I also noted just one quick thing about St. Louis that before it was St. Louis, and by the way, St. Louis, right, is a reference to an homage to a Catholic, Catholic French king. That's where that name comes from. Before that, this little kind of trading center was mostly known as Mound City for all of the Native American ceremonial and burial grounds in this area. They've all mostly been raped, right? With the exception of one, Sugarloaf Mound, which just this February was repatriated to the Osage right here. So that's how recent, like the reckoning of this history still is unfolding here in St. Louis and in fact all across the country. So.
Thank you for that introduction. You know, when I was doing, back when my first book came out, I was doing science and like this, I forgot to read from my book. I forgot to open up my book. I would just talk. And I think it's so much better for someone to have a sense of what you're doing from reading the text. That just helps so much. And that story is really captivating. Not fiction. When a movie opens up it opens you to the first couple of scenes of a movie, you want to have something catching your attention and so forth. And that's a true story, catching our attention and pulling us into a couple of things that you want readers to walk away with. I'd be curious to know, and I think for those of us listening, when someone reads that, what do you want them to walk away with? I mean, there are lots of stories lots of books about race in the United States. What do they want us to know?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting in terms of the writing process. That story was, the book tries to take a deep dive in 3 locations, right? So Mississippi, Oklahoma, and Minnesota. And this story I originally came across doing the research for the Minnesota chapter, right? It's because that's where they end up. It is up in St. Paul. And it was like literally in the middle of the manuscript. And then I suddenly realized when I got toward the end of the book, I was like, oh, no, like that story should come up front, right? So it like moved it really toward the end of the writing process up to the front, because and I think what I wanted there is, again, to kind of weave together, like we can understand, I think, the story of America, like the first chapter that's in is called Before America, is where I begin the story. That we can't really understand where we are, who we are, without understanding the whole story, right? And behind the thing I never got growing up is I got almost no Native American history, right? And I went to public school, and so I'm from Mississippi. I got plenty of Civil War history, no Reconstruction, but lots of Civil War history and kind of Revolutionary War and the Civil War. Got a lot of that, but almost nothing before that. Right, just white people arrived and we had a country, and and so one thing that I hope that story does is it just means you can't understand really white history in this country. You can't understand Christian history in this country without understanding the longer story of how we got here, and why the divisions are the way they are, why the maps look the way they do, why that's the thing that I think has given me is whenever I go to a new place now, I look at the map and I was like, that's a Native American name, right? This is named after some European, king, so, and that, the Mississippi, that's Native American term, right? And I think it gives me a depth, right, of the history, and a kind of critical way of seeing it. Like you can't tell a story about America that, I guess one of the way I do it is in the book, the story, my image of America growing up, I think, so I grew up in the 70s. So like, I remember the bicentennial celebration, right? And the main image I have of, like, if you'd ask me about America, it was some white dude in their colonial knickers, their white socks and their belt buckles and their black shoes. And it came from that image of, it's an image from Philadelphia, right? Of this painting of all the kind of founding fathers arranged around the table, kind of awkwardly, so you can see all of them, signing the Declaration of Independence. And that was like my image of the founding of the country. And of course, the 1619 Project blew that up. But what people forget about the 1619 Project, I think, is it not only changed the starting point of the timeline by literally calling it, no, not 1776, you got to begin back here. But I think what people mostly forget is, I'd be curious if anybody remembers when it was published in the New York Times, does anybody remember that there was an image that went along with it? Unfortunately did not get carried to the cover of the book, but does anybody remember the image? I have to go back and look at it. So the image that went along with it was this very stark monochromatic black and white image that had just an endless horizon line, and it was the dark ocean against the gray sky.
Oh, I do remember.
Yeah, and it was just this, that's all it was, dark ocean, horizontal line, gray sky. And so if you think about that, that's really powerful, right? Not these white guys gathered around the table in Philadelphia in 1776, but this ocean, right? Because that means we have to tell the story of the transatlantic slave trade, right? We can't do that. We can't tell the story of who we are without telling that story. And then I think, pushing back further, one of the things I'm arguing in the book is like a kind of yes and to the 1619 project. And you have to remember that even by 1619, the European interaction with Native people was more than a century old already by the time we get to 1619. So yes, we can't tell the story of who we are without that, but we also have to kind of back it all the way up. And so in the book, I argue we have to really take it back to not 1492, which is the other year we may all know, right? Like the year Columbus sailed the ocean blue, the little rhyme, but actually 1493, because 1493 is the year that Columbus goes back, and everybody remembers, like, he does the voyage, he goes back, and he's like, success, right? He doesn't really know where he's been, but he knows he wants to go back, and he needs more ships, more soldiers, more missionaries, more supplies, all of that, which he gets, right, from staying on his second and third voyages. But the other thing everybody forgets that he asked for, he also asked for something else from the church. And what he asked for the church is a moral mandate for what he was about to do. And he got that from the closest thing to international law that existed at the time, and that was the Catholic Church. And he got this thing, he got them to issue a papal bull in 1493 that basically blessed, right, this kind of colonial, it's called the Doctrine of Discovery. It was a whole set of papal bulls between 1452 and 1493, but the 1493 one is directly because of Columbus here on this continent, blessing what he was doing. And that document spells out, right? It says, yes, in the name of the church, in the name of God, you have the right to take these lands, to steal these possessions. And it says, if they refuse, you can kill them, or, and I'll quote here, you can submit them to perpetual slavery, right? This is spelled out in this church document. And so I think it's that longer history of like where we are, and I'm writing out of time. I background in theology. I am a religious studies professor, so I'm also writing in many ways personally, right? That this is if you were from European descent and Christian, you can't really understand what it means to be an American Christian without understanding this.
Here's the quote directly here. Quoting you, and then the quote itself. The doctrine of this is the doctrine of discovery, in short, merged the interests of European imperialism, including the African slave trade, with Christian missionary zeal. Dum diversas, the initial edict that laid the theological and political foundations for the doctrine, was issued by Pope Nicholas V on June 18, 1452, and explicitly granted Portuguese King Alfonso V the following rights, and this is from the Doctrine of Discovery: to invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens, meaning Muslims, and pagans whatsoever. That's like a broad swath. That's anybody like Christian, basically. And other enemies of Christ, wheresoever placed, and the kingdoms, dukedoms, principalities, dominions, possessions, and all movable and immovable goods whatsoever held and possessed by them, and to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery. And it's fascinating to consider enemies of Christ. Who did Christ declare as enemies, under the category of enslavable? of destroying. It's an interesting blend here between the imperial and the religion and the expansion and the accumulation, so forth, that marks imperialism.
Yeah, and you can understand so much about the modern world. For example, like the only reason why we have one South American country speaking Portuguese is because of this document.
Mm-hmm.
Right? They literally drew a vertical line down the map, and Brazil happens to stick out on the eastern side of that vertical line that they drew. Right? So Portugal gets that. Right.
You know, I've always identified with that with the Treaty of Tordesillas. I thought that was interesting. Your recognition here of the document was fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's just like, oh, that's why.
Yeah. Right.
That's why it looks like that. That's why that's there. You know, because I think that's been my journey. I think it's just been, as I dug more into this history, it has just been this kind of eye-opening experience of like, okay, this all makes so much more sense to kind of understand not only the landmarks and the language and the segregation, all of it, right?
Sure.
Everything from redlining, so why is it that all the white people live over here and all the non-white people live over here? Like, oh, actually, that's not an accident, right? And I think the thing behind it that's so stunning is that for someone who like me, so I grew up Southern Baptist in Mississippi, and it wasn't until I was at Synod that I realized that, oh wait, that word Southern that's not just a compass point, right? That's a worldview.
Sure.
In that word Southern. We were founded in 1845 to divide ourselves from our northern brethren, to make enslaving other people based on the color of their skin compatible with the gospel. That's the beginning point of the Southern Baptist Convention, which then becomes the largest expression of Protestant Christianity in the country. Right? So again, if you realize that, like, the trajectory of the largest expression of Protestant Christianity, that's the genesis story of it. Then the sort of like white Christians justifying segregation, white Christians justifying slavery suddenly makes a lot more sense.
Sure. I find those moves most fascinating. I think it was you also who identified the racist characteristics of different Christian groups. I think it was in your, correct me if I'm wrong, in prologue, you identified 8 out of 10 evangelicals from a racist perspective, a high number of mainstream Christians, and so this is kind of baked in to a sacred worldview. It's referencing something I wanted to talk about a little later, about our notion of order, and how racism, specifically our concept of human being, is itself not in reference to anything biological, but a concept of order. And this notion of order has a faithfulness to it. Oh, that's right. Does that make sense? Can you hear me? Okay, I should hold it a little closer. Sorry. It has a sacred, something sacred that's referenced. I want to put a pin on that. I'm going to come back to that.
Yeah, we should definitely come back to that.
Come back to this notion of terms of order. But I also want to make mention of the fact that you writing this with your Southern background reminds me a bit of Wendell Berry.
Oh. Hey, that's good company.
Right. Wendell Berry's book, The Hidden Wound, in specific, where he's digging into his family's racial past. And why would somebody dredge up this stuff? Why does it make sense for the nation to recognize not 1776 and a mythic history of greatness and valor, but its history of terror and cruelty? Why does that make sense for us to spend time engaging? I mean, I've got I asked that because I've got my sense of why it's the case, but what would you say?
Yeah. Well, I'll go at this with an example. So I've this is like the third book in the last 10 years, and it was kind of an unintentional trilogy, but it was mostly because there was a problem here. I just kept needing to get to the bottom of it. And like I'd get up to a point, right, and then realize, oh wait, there's more of this story I've got to nail down. So just a quick trajectory. In 2016, I wrote a book called The End of White Christian America, and it was about this sense of order, of like, this is who the country is, and law and order and all of that stuff fits into that mold. But the idea that for so many Americans who look like me, America was synonymous with being kind of a white Christian country, and we're seeing a lot of that language come right back out as in this moment, especially. But that it was also I was trying to understand what I kind of half jokingly call the great white Christian freakout moment that we're seeing in this country, and like what's happening, right? Like, and it was I looked at some my day job. I look at a lot of demographic change and public opinion data, and I noticed that, oh, actually, here's what's happening. That people are responding to what they really know the numbers or not. We've actually moved in the last 20 years from being a majority white Christian country to one that's no longer a majority white Christian. The demographics in this country, and I think the thing that kind of like supercharged the reaction was that sea change happened during the presidency of our first black president. So we've got this symbolic presence that's very visible, right? And I think something the thing is, he was not just elected, but he was reelected, right? And I think that's the moment people are like, oh wait, this wasn't a fluke. This is actually something real, like some real shit we're going to have to deal with. That happened. So if you look at 2008 when Obama first ran for president, the country was 54% white and Christian. Take all Christians, Protestant, Catholic, non-denomination, who identified as white and non-Hispanic, 54%. So still comfortably majority white and Christian. Just 8 years later, at the end of his second term, that number is 47. Right? So we kind of moved. That number today is 41. Right? So we've kind of continued this kind of shift. And I think that's part of what the response is. It's kind of a slipping of power, slipping of the just sheer numbers, right, in the country. The next book I wrote was in 2020. It was called White Too Long. That is a quote from James Baldwin from a New York Times op-ed that he wrote shortly after Martin Luther King was killed. And it just was so piercing to me when I came on it, actually fairly late in my 40s, where I really read much Baldwin. But that he said there, that, and he was in this moment of kind of despair, mostly that this had happened and there was not this great uprising of white people to say, like, no, right, in the wake of King's assassination. And he writes, he says, I get it mostly right, the great majority of white Americans impressed me and have so impressed me for some time as being beyond any conceivable hope of moral rehabilitation. They have been white, if I may so put it, too long. They have been married to the line of white supremacy too long. And it goes on, it's just this amazingly eloquent thing. And so I took that white too long phrase for the title of the book, but I was wrestling then, like, why dredge it up? I mean, I was wrestling with the oldest thing I have in my possession is a family Bible. It was handed down for 6 generations on my mother's side. It was printed in 1815. It was carried by my family on their migration from Virginia to Georgia. And my family's been in Georgia since the early 1800s. Both my parents were raised in that same county. So for 6 generations, both sides of my family in and around Macon, Georgia, Bibb County, Twiggs County, about an hour south of Atlanta, Macon is. And so, like, there's something to be said about that. Like, that's the only object that my family has taken the care, passed down, and to kind of cherish, right? This religious sacred text. In between the Old and New Testaments, there's about 4 generations of marriages and deaths, or genealogy section of marriages, births, deaths, kind of inscribed in this kind of very fancy, oxidized, brown script that you see in old documents. But I was doing genealogy research, and I found another document from that same thing. in Georgia. His name was Pleasant Moon, the owner of that Bible. It's a male British name, Pleasant Moon. But I found the estate seller for him when he died. And they list everything on the estate. And so it was like, a bear, one bay mare, a cart, 6 head of sheep, a feather bed, 6 chairs, a kitchen table, and then there were 4 human beings on that list, right? A woman named Naomi at $400, Bird, a boy, at $150. And then it went on to other objects, right, in the house. And the thing that I realized there is that I can't understand who I am. I can't understand who my family is without reconciling these 2 documents, right? That they can so cherish their faith as this is the only object they have made sure comes down, and that this is what they believe, that same family. That there was no conflict between this Bible they cherish and these people they insult. And so for me, it's really been about trying to get clarity on, it's an identity, like who are we, right? And to tell the truth about that. And there was also kind of one last thing I'll say, I was angry.
Mm-hmm.
And I was angry because I realized I'd been lied to.
Mm-hmm.
I've been lied to by my teachers, right, who never taught me this history. I've been lied to by my family who covered it up. I've been lied to by my church. I was the kid. I was at church like 5 times a week, right? I don't know how many of you grew up Southern Baptist, but you could go Sunday morning, Sunday night, Monday night, Tuesday night, Wednesday night, and that was normal. Like that wasn't like I was just kind of what people did. And I never once heard a sermon explaining what the word Southern and Southern Baptist meant. I never once heard a sermon about segregation, even though I lived through, like I'm 57 years old, and I lived through the desegregation of Jackson, Mississippi's public schools in 1976. Mm-hmm. Right? That's how long it took to actually get, and like my church never mentioned anything about, there was not a sermon, not a Sunday. Great conspiracy of silence among the adults about this sea change in our social life. So I was angry about that, right? And I don't like being lied to, and I wanted to kind of live in a way that had some integrity to it. And so I think it's just been, and so I'm a scholar, I'm a writer, and like writing books is the way I've been trying to kind of get to the bottom.
Sure. Thank you for that. I sure can remember being angry as well, recognizing that I had been lied to. Mine is a bit different. Mine is in the first year of a PhD program, been accepted into the program in my mind because they were trying to diversify. But when my mentor confronted me around that assumption, letting me know that I had been accepted on merit and that I have not been any easier on you with the grading, have I? It dawned on me that I had been living with this belief about Black, that it's the ability to examine who you are that gives you a better sense of caring for not only yourself, but people around you, our way of relating in the world. That's an important place to be. I mean, I write about the Harlem Renaissance, and the Harlem Renaissance is this moment in Black history where Black people are publicly engaging this notion of human. And what does it mean? Who counts as such? One might say that the way we organize society in the West is by the notion of, by myth. Myth here is not reference to something, the fictive stories of pre-scientific people, not that kind of myth. Myth here is in reference to the ideological backdrop that structures the way we know ourselves and everything else in society. So one might say that in that understanding of myth, human is not in reference to anything biological. Here I'm borrowing from a scholar named Frank Wilderson, who talks about Afro-pessimism, which is another way of thinking about the notion of race in the world. That human is not in reference to something biological. It is, in fact, it's a term of order identifying a concept that needs its other, like a picture It needs its other in order to be visible, to be legible. So when we engage in these conversations about race, we're also engaging in this notion of what is a European myth, a European, I mean, to borrow another term from the Academy of Epistemology, which is a way of knowing the science, study of knowledge acquisition and justified belief. That's what epistemology is. It's how you distinguish knowledge from opinion. So what do we know about human? Stuff that's been imagined out of Europe. They've created over centuries of time this understanding of human being. And it really gets ramped up in this process of discovery, of westward expansion, spaces where they didn't believe that people could inhabit. And they get there and there are people inhabiting that space. Then they write those people into history. They invent them in a European ideology of human difference by comparison to the normal people, right? So this then is the foundation for what we would describe as order.
Actually, when you think of that, I mean, back to this enemies of Christ phrase. I mean, there was a Christian way that human got defined, and so are you a friend of Christ or an enemy of Christ, right? Are you in or you out? And it got inscribed by a colonial world, right? And so it was exactly that, like a way of kind of saying, oh, these people are enemies of Christ, which immediately erases any rights or recognition.
And the colonists were just being objective, right?
Yeah.
Just objective. They're just describing what they're seeing, right?
Yeah.
Of course not.
And the other word that goes along with, speaking of order, the other word that you see over and over in these documents, it was really striking to me that every time there's a justification for really early on, in both for like these arguments, oh, well, Africans are actually better off here,
Sure.
right? Even under slavery, they're better off here.
Sure.
Indigenous people are better off on reservations, right, than they were out roaming in the woods, that kind of language. But it's all the word that you see over and over are the pairing. The word pair to justify it is Christianity and civilization. Christianity and civilization. Oh, it's right through the documents, through the just pop culture in those eras, and it was a way of saying, like, yeah, it's European kind of norms, European institutions. And justified with Christian theology, that's what creates order. Right? That's the thing that we're preserving. And anything that's outside of that, right? That's how you get the Native American boarding schools. It's how you get slavery. It's all about this. There's a painting, the Argentine scene that I'm actually blanking on the title of it, but it's a Manifest Destiny painting done in the middle of the 19th century. When this was very much, everywhere, right? And it is you may remember the title. You describe it's a white woman.
I always show it.
Yeah.
I know exactly.
You remember the title of it? I'm blanking on the title of
it. I think it is just titled Manifest Destiny.
It may be, but she's flying over the plains, right?
Carrying a book in one hand and wires behind her.
And the telegraph wires in the other.
Yeah, right.
And so if you look what happens, is the white woman looks like a kind of Greek goddess, right? She's literally in a toga. She's kind of way up in the air. She's flying over, and she's flying east to west. And she's probably about over Missouri, where she stops, right, in the painting. She's leaning forward. Yeah, she's carrying a school book and the telegraph wires. She's stringing along behind her. And if you look what's happening in her shadow, or kind of in her wake, not her shadow, because actually that part of the painting is brighter. In her shadow, or in her wake, are white settlers. There it is. Yeah. You can probably flip around. I can probably see get a little bit of it. Are white settlers in the back here, and what's popping up in her wake are fences and farms, right, with white people kind of fencing in the land and cultivating it. And then what's
sorry for those of you in the back.
Yeah, what's leaning away from her on the other side are indigenous people who are like looking kind of in fear.
In the dark part.
Yeah, and it gets darker on that side. They're running into the darkness toward the Pacific Ocean. And there are dead buffalo on the ground and buffalo fleeing with the Native Americans, right? And this was like the positive image of Christianity and civilization being brought to the country. That is what that arch, like, that's the portal, right? Literally the portal. That is kind of like that vision of the country and like westward expansion is so much of what got us to where we are today.
She is the expansion of technology and knowledge, which is part. These are kind of foundation for civilization itself, over and against the darker people.
Yeah, and the other history behind her too is that she is. There's a longer history in early American art. We kind of lost it a little bit of Columbia, the feminine version of Columbus, right? So from 1492, Columbia becomes the kind of feminine image of the country, and she's also an echo of that early kind of things in art as well. And interestingly enough, just like a sidebar here, the image of Columbia survives all the way into the early 20th century. And the thing that actually kills Columbia as a positive image of manifest destiny is that women suffragists adopted.
Oh.
And suddenly she was dangerous.
Yeah.
Right? And she got, and so what she got replaced with was Lady Liberty, the Statue of Liberty, who was safely out on Ellis Island, right, in bronze. Right, and kind of perched and planted, not this free spirit, right, of Columbia flowing across the country. So there's like all these kind of layers. But yeah, this I never really connected manifest destiny to Christian theology in that type, in that sense that it's all about providence and Christianity and civilization marching into a glorious future.
So again, back to the reasons for this kind of thing. While some say that highlighting bad parts of the nation's history only serve to make white people feel guilty and walk around with a guilt complex, it doesn't really do much for society. Therefore, we want to create the 1776 Commission and talk about mythic greatness, as opposed to all of this bad stuff in the past. I tend to engage this history from a perspective of a theory of the logic that structures how we live together, much the same way that a doctor might study a body. But I'm wondering, I mean, if we were to sit here today and say, this is why this matters, why we need to make sure that we have more of these kinds of books, and everybody, all hands on deck here, we need to look at this. What would you say?
Well, I think the most fundamental thing to say is that we ought not live a lie. Like I grew up Christian, and like if there was, we had this like we would sing anthems like "You will know the truth, and the truth will make you free," right? As if that was something easy to do. And I think that statement is true, right? That you will know the truth, and the truth will make you free. And if you're living a lie, you are not free.
Right.
And so I think for me, and I think Baldwin is like really on this, right? For white people, Baldwin was saying to white people, like, you are not free if you are living this lie, right? And you're dragging all the rest of us along with you into this lie. And at the end of the day, it ends in violence and death.
And that lie, say it graphically, the lie is white supremacy.
Yeah. No, absolutely. That's why the word white supremacy is in the title of the book, right? Is that's the lie. And that, by the way, like, isn't the KKK, right? It's not, that's not what I'm talking about. I mean, it is the KKK, but it's not just the KKK. I think many of us you know, look like me, want to make it. It's just that
They're not
back in
the main
20s.
figures of white supremacy.
Yeah,
That's not what
it's these white cheated people back in the 20s.
Right.
Some black and white photograph. Has nothing to do with it. But I think it's the sense though that like if you just flip the words around, that's what I often do with white audiences. Instead of white supremacy, which is kind of a term of jargon, like it's the supremacy of white people, right? And you just that's just undeniable, right? So if you look at like, yeah, why do all the white people own property in the better areas of town, and brown and black people and indigenous people live in flood zones and near factory pollution, right? Why did all the white people get the better schools and the black and brown people got the not so good schools and used textbooks 10 years later? You know, all of that. Why do white people get the libraries and the parks and swimming pools, right? I mean, you have an ease rate on swimming pools, etc. That's all because we thought all the good stuff should go to the white people, right? Those lives were more important, more valuable, more deserving.
It is a practice of order.
Yeah.
Again. Here, I want to.
We're getting a sign. We're close to time.
We've got just a few minutes left, so if we want to do a Q&A or
Oh, okay.
final thought.
Yeah.
Yeah. You've been listening to us for a long time now,
To be fun.
and there's lots more to. I feel like we're just scratching the surface. But I actually want to hear from. I want any questions.
Yeah, I just want to say too that we haven't talked about it, but if you want to ask a question about Bonhoeffer's Black Jesus, there's a tie to what we're talking about in here for sure.
There is overlap. There's definitely overlap. And I would want to say something about what white supremacy is. And I put two of them together, racism and white supremacy. They both talk about the same phenomenon with the definition of that. But we can, I mean, now I've said it, I got to say the definition. So I would argue that racism is the ideology that structures the Western world around human difference. Though we know red, yellow, black, and white not as an objective perspective on human difference, but in fact as an argument for the human, for white ascendancy. For example, the Ashanti or the Mindi coming from Africa had no idea, still don't. They're black. Red have no idea that they're red. What is a yellow person? The definition of difference that we enter into in the Western world is an argument. It's not objective science, and it's never been real science in the first place about biological difference. It is that structure that gives us, it is that argument that gives us ascendancy and why they should be able to buy and sell, like people own land, and have society ordered as it is, such that gives us a sense of the sacred around order. That leadership represents some kind of faith system as well that sets the moral nature or structure of their leadership and of order. He's a baby Christian.
I'll grab your microphone. The air conditioning's pretty loud, so I'm gonna run this to anyone who has a question. Yeah.
So this is for you. The passage you read, you said once you saw that in your research, you knew you wanted to open the book with that. Were there any sources that you found in your research that changed your thesis or the three regions that you wanted to focus on?
That's a great question, and I'll try to be brief so we can get maybe a couple questions. So what's interesting about, if you went back and looked at the original proposal for the book, the places were there, Mississippi, Oklahoma, Minnesota. I kind of knew, because I had kind of told a little bit of those stories in the previous book, and I knew there was more to tell. What was not there was the doctrine of discovery in my original proposal. What was not really there in a way that I had to bring up in parody was the fullness of the story of Native Americans. It wasn't really until I got into the research, I was like, oh, like that's the story, right? And so that the whole thing around the Doctor of Discovery that like sets all this up, and then I realized that every story I had to tell about enslavement and white supremacy toward Africans had a pre-story, right, around Native Americans, and I had to tell those two things together. And in fact, it was enough. I had to fight with my editor about this, right, because it's like, well, that's not the book you pitched. It's like, no, it's not, but it's the book I need to write, you know. But I think that's the great thing about like research, and you know, if you're following the lead, you sometimes find the story in the middle. And I think that's what happened.
Maybe I can say just real quickly, what I might see as a connection between our books is this notion of order. How many have heard of the name Dietrich Bonhoeffer? Okay, most everybody. Dietrich Bonhoeffer is a German pastor and theologian who was killed by the Nazis in 1945 for very, very public resistance against it. He's an Aryan, meaning he fits the description of the ideal human that Hitler was building a country, building a world. Very well educated, but he dies in a concentration camp like people who are being pushed to the edge of society. He refused that status. He comes over to the United States when he's 24 years old and studies in New York. He's in New York during the Harlem Renaissance when they're questioning what the meaning of human is. He's studying that, and he's attending a Black Baptist church. This other notion of human, of sacred, and of life together. Then he goes back to Germany right when Hitler's movement is picking up steam, and he's one of the only Christians who are identifying racism as a Christian problem. That's what the book is about. I'm paying close attention to that moment in his life and what it means afterwards. I was fascinated that some producers read the book. That's their own. That's not mine. Okay, it's not mine. So we've had our back and forth about that. But there is that connection about white supremacy.
Yeah.
Any final questions before we move to the signing?
I don't know how to phrase this as a question. Should I?
Yeah.
I have tremendous respect. And I grew up in Ann Arbor, Michigan, where the University of Michigan is, so it's a pretty diverse area. So grew up in the Christian church, thinking that racism was over. And through time, I moved around. I lived in Stafford, Virginia for 7 years, just an hour south of DC. And I've been here for 7 years. And it's a very different environment. And I've become aware of how, one can feel kind of self-righteous and thinking that, and you move and you realize, oh, I'm really part of this. And this is like, I'm in this culture, and then trying to figure out what to do. And so I don't know how to answer this question because I don't expect you to, fill that in for me and figure out what my role is in being honest with the church and with my Christian friends when they say, but is there something you see as a wedge or like a pry bar for, my dad, he doesn't live here, he's in another state, but really believes that God was doing something special at the founding of our country.
Sure.
And is still doing something now. And there's no, there's no wedge or pry, and I think when I hear both of you, like how you came to this, from as a white man from the background that you were in, was you were interested in learning and you were curious about history. And so when someone doesn't have that, is there any, I don't expect an answer, I guess, but I really appreciate this. And if you have anything for that.
Sure.
Yeah, it's a tricky thing. We're going to just say we should all buckle up, right? Because next year is the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. So 1776 is going to come roaring back next year, right? And you can imagine what that's going to look like with this administration running the show. The last thing he did on his way out of office was, you already mentioned it, was form the 1776 Commission, whose only purpose was to undermine the 1619 Project.
Right.
That was its genesis story. He packed it with people who were only interested in that, and you can know that's coming back. Right. So I mean, I think one of the things that we're going to have a huge fight over history next year. Right, we're already kind of leaning into it. The military parade that we saw, like I live in Washington D.C. That parade was like 6 miles from my house. That was just like a little dip your toe in the, that kind of thing. We're going to see a lot more of that. I think the one thing that we have to do is like, I'm kind of hoping, and I'm speaking to a lot of predominantly white congregations about this, that like if we could just get white Christians to stop lying. Like it would make a huge difference, right? And that shouldn't be a heavy lift. Right? Like, let's just stop lying. Let's just tell the truth and be interested in telling the truth, right? Have some integrity. Like we want to live in integrity. And again, this kind of we should know the truth. Truth shall make you free. Like we preach that from our pulpits all the time, right? But to realize that like one of the hardest things to do in this regime, and with the kind of stuff that's coming, particularly next year, it's going to be an election year. And it's going to be the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, is that like that little challenge of like telling the truth is going to be very, very hard for people to do because it's going to really be going against the flow. So I'm hoping that there's that. But to me, it really is a matter of integrity, right? That I just don't want to live a lie. Like I want to really understand who I am, where we've been, how we got here. The world makes a lot more sense. Like when you understand this. Yeah.
I'll try this framing as well. The family has a history of abuse. If we look back at the history of the family and try to paint the abuse in nice terms, the kids and the parents don't relate to each other well. The kids don't have the possibility of the life they can in the family or in life in general without addressing trauma that they've survived. One way to look at it. The other way to look at it, in her book, In the Wake, Christina Sharp describes the reason why she names it In the Wake. The wake is the terrain after a storm. It is the right after a death, before the funeral, wake. We are in the wake of, as he's describing here, the massacre of Native Americans and the transatlantic slave trade. We are on this terrain in this moment in the wake of that. To simply describe it in valorous terms, the mythic greatness, past mythic greatness, is not to do the grieving that we must do, is to refuse to look at this chasm that is right in front of us. Instead, rather to call it by names that do not describe the catastrophe that is right there.
I love that metaphor because I mean the last part of the book is in the past and shared American future. I don't know if you chapters on hope at the end, but I think this is exactly right. That's the only way for it.
Mm-hmm.
It is the only way for it. Right? If you want the next generation, our kids and grandchildren, to be free of this stuff. Yeah, we have to do the work to kind of get through.
Amen.
Everyone, let's give one more round of applause. Thank you. And thank you all so much for coming. We've got books at the front desks from both of our writers here, so please check that out if you don't have your copy yet. Like I mentioned at the beginning, we are going to have a double feature tonight, so I will ask everybody, if you're not staying for our second event, though I encourage you to do so, I will ask you to just go down over to the next room. The signing is going to be in that back corner. If you're familiar with the store, it's our psychology and religion section, typically. So feel free to keep mingling and keeping the conversation going. So thank you for joining us.